A racist police officer thought he could bully an old black man, but he didn't know the man was the police captain's father. What happened next will make you question everything. Stay tuned to see justice served in a way you never expected. Let's begin the story. Only a few people were sipping coffee and a waitress leaning against the counter with a newspaper when James Carter walked into the diner. He gave the waitress a nod and sat down at a small corner table by the window, putting his hands on the table and looking at his watch. His son Jordan was running late, but he didn't mind. He'd always been good at waiting. He felt the stares and gave them a few quick glances to remind him that he was in a mostly white diner in a neighborhood he rarely visited, but he didn't think about it. It was just another day and another cup of coffee in a different town. He signaled the waitress to come over, and she approached him with a neutral expression. "Just a coffee, please," he said, and she poured him a cup without saying a word. While looking around, James wrapped his hands around the hot mug and enjoyed its warmth. He heard the doorbell and looked over his shoulder to see that someone new had come in, a tall, broad police officer with a face that seemed to be permanently frowning. The officer's eyes swept the room and landed on James. He didn't look away. Instead, he walked over his heavy boots on the linoleum floor and stopped by James's table, crossing his arms to cast a shadow over his coffee. "You lost or something?" the officer asked, his voice carrying a hint of urgency. "Just waiting for my son," James answered calmly as if it were a normal question, but he knew it wasn't because he'd heard that tone too many times before. The officer frowned and looked around the diner, saying, "Don't see too many people like you around here. How long do you plan to wait?" After raising his coffee to his lips and slowly sipping it, James answered, "As long as it takes, officer." The officer laughed, curling his lips into a grin. "This isn't the place for loitering people to get nervous." James kept his eyes steady. "Hey, I'm just having coffee and not trying to bother anyone." Leaning in closer, the cop said, "Old man, show me some ID." James looked the officer in the eyes and reached into his coat pocket to pull out his veteran's ID. He studied it carefully and then watched as the officer took it, barely looking at it, and threw it back on the table with a sneer. "A vet? Not sure I'm buying it," the officer said, his voice full of disbelief. "You think some ID is enough to make you belong here?" James didn't flicker. "Yes, believe it or not, I know who I am." The officer laughed loudly enough to get some looks from the other customers. "Yeah, and I know the type, acting all polite pretending to injure somebody." James's temper momentarily faltered, but he kept his cool. "You got a problem with me?" "Officer, my problem is people like you who think they can walk in wherever they want and expect to be treated with respect. You're out of place, and I don't like it when people like you push their luck," the officer said in a harsh whisper. "I'm just a man having coffee. I'm not looking for trouble, but trouble finds you, doesn't it?" James said quietly. "Maybe it's time you left before I make it official," the officer suggested. James took a deep breath and tightened his grip on the coffee mug. He could feel the officer's weighty stare and the growing anger in his voice. He looked at his watch to see how much longer his son would be in distress and thought, "Maybe I'll just wait here." James finally spoke in a firm voice. The officer's face turned serious. "Himself, old man. Just know I'll be watching." Although Blake was standing over James, he tightened his grip on the edge of the table. The officer's face was narrowed and full of disgust. "I told you once, old man. I don't want to tell you again," Blake said. Blake's voice was cold, and the words fell out. "You're not welcome here, and people like you think they can just walk in and sit down wherever they want with no problem." James looked up at him, his face calm but with a hint of anger. "I'm here waiting for my son. I have every right to sit here and have a coffee," he repeated. "Rights are for people who earn them, not some washed-up old man with a fake idea," Blake said, with a sarcastic grin as he leaned forward. James's voice answered, heavy, steely like any other warrior. "I gained that ID and the title that goes with it." Blake scoffed at the guys. "Guys, you always have a story. Aren't you always talking about how hard things were and how much you earned?" He looked down at James and said, "Maybe you haven't earned anything but a one-way ticket out of here." James's voice got louder. Blake laughed angrily, his voice reverberating through the diner. "Oh, I think you're making quite a bit of noise just sitting here looking like you don't belong." He reached over and pushed James's coffee mug across the table with a rough flick of his hand. The mug teetered before tipping over, spilling its contents onto James's coat and dripping onto the floor. James took a slow breath to steady himself. He leaned closer, though, and Blake pulled at his lips with a sneer. "You're making this place look bad. You know that a place like this doesn't need people like you bringing it down," Blake said in a voice that was loud enough for people nearby to look at them nervously. James looked the police officer in the eyes and said in a low, firm voice, "I'm not going anywhere. I'll leave when my son gets here, not because you're having a fit. You don't get to talk to me like that, old man. I'm the law here. You don't just sit around disrespecting me like you're above the law." Blake spat the words out, his tone getting darker. "Respect has to be earned." James's voice was razor sharp, and Blake's face was shaking. "Twisted in fury gained you. You're talking about gaining respect by acting all-important with your veteran position like you're better than everyone else. This makes me feel like I deserve to be here just as much as everyone else." Answering quietly, James with his eyes flashing, Blake said, "Oh, you do deserve something." He got closer, and his voice was full of disdain. "People like you act like you're above the rules, like you're something special. I don't think I'm unique." James answered with less patience, "I know my rights, and I know that having coffee here isn't hurting anyone." Blake's lips curled into a sneer, and he leaned forward and spat on James's coat. For a split second, the room stopped moving as people gasped, and even the waitress took a step back in shock. James clenched his jaw and palms together on the table, but he didn't move as he stared up at Blake. "Wasn't it disgusting?" he said with a sarcastic smile. "That's what you are, something to be spat on, something that doesn't belong." James calmed down and asked, "Do you think that the badge on your chest makes you better?" Blake smiled and said, "It's not the badge, old man. It's what I stand for: order and control. You people don't understand. Get up and leave now, or I'll drag you out myself." James's speech was barely audible above a whisper. "My problems are worse than yours, officer, and I'm not going to move." His face turned dark, and he put a hard hand on James's shoulder, but James didn't flinch. "You're making a mistake," he said. "If you want to talk about respect," Blake hissed, "then you should know when to back down and listen to authority. Power doesn't give you the right to hurt people," James said, his voice getting louder with each word. "If you think that pushing me around makes you stronger, then you don't understand respect." Blake's face turned angry, and he pushed the table so hard that it fell to the side. When James's chair shook, he almost fell to the floor. The officer's face turned red, and his breathing got rough. He reached down, grabbed James's shoulder, and pulled him to his feet. "Leave," he yelled, his voice reverberating through the diner. "You don't belong here, and I don't want to see you again." James calmed down, his voice calm but stern. "I don't answer to people like you. I answer to my own beliefs, and I'm not going to give up." With angry eyes, Blake pushed James backward and said, "Okay, tough guy, see what happens. What a brave person you are in a cell." He roughly grabbed James's arms and put handcuffs on him, as people stood there stunned into quiet. "You think you're above the law," he said. Blake spat in a rude voice. "Well, let's see how that works out for you." While Blake pushed James roughly toward the police car, his wrists strained against the cuffs and his calm, weathered face started to crack. The officer's smug, successful grins seemed to push him closer to a line he rarely crossed. "You think this makes you tough, don't you?" he asked. "Do you think that pushing an old man around and using your weight like this makes you a big man?" James asked in a low, angry voice. Blake sneered and barely looked back. "Keep talking, old man. You won't change your path," he said. When James laughed out loud, he was angry. "Where I'm going, boy. I've been places you couldn't survive for a minute. Men twice as big as you have stared me down. I didn't take half of the disrespect you're giving me now." Blake stopped in his tracks and looked at James. He said, "You think you deserve respect?" with a sour face. "You think sitting there acting like you're better than everyone makes you worth a damn?" James laughed coldly. James's eyes narrowed even more than everyone else's, and he repeated it. Rising, "If you want to talk about acting, look at how cocky you look in that outfit. You're just a bully with a button-down shirt." Blake's face, he tightened his grip on James's arm, angry. "Watch it, old man. You're already in deep enough," he said. James yanked his arm free from the cuffs and snapped. "You think you're special because you get to push people around. You think that uniform makes you invincible. I'm supposed to cower because you have a badge." As James's words hit home, the officer's face turned red and his breathing sped up. He looked around and saw a few shocked customers and bystanders watching them with their eyes moving nervously between him and the veteran. Blake growled, and his voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "You're going to shut up right now, or I swear you'll what?" James stopped what he was saying. "As it stands, you're already beating me up and throwing me around like trash. Are you going to beat up an old man in public next because you can't handle the truth?" Blake's face turned angry, and he spat at James. The glob hit his coat with a sickening splat. "There you are," Blake hissed and smiled as he saw the spit run down the cloth. James looked down, his jaw clenched, and something inside him snapped. "You think that makes you strong? You're a coward," he yelled, his voice filled with anger. "You think that makes you strong? You're a disgrace to that uniform." Blake struggled to keep his cool for a second, his hands getting tighter as he spoke. "You don't know a damn thing about me, old man," he growled. "You're a nobody, a washed up." "Oh, I know enough," James shot back with fiery eyes. "I know you're a scared little man hiding behind that badge, because you'd be nothing without it. You're the type who needs a uniform just to feel important, aren't you?" This made the man laugh. Blake's face turned red, and he stepped closer. His voice was barely a hiss. "I will make sure you spend the night in a cell if you still talk. If I have to, I'll throw away the key." The tone of James's voice was cocky and rude. "Throw me in jail if that's all you know how to do," he said. "But remember, you're the one showing your true colors. You are the one acting like a scared, mean bully." Blake twitched his lips and grabbed James by the shoulder, pushing him hard toward the car. "Enough with this. I'm ending it right now," he said. James pulled back, and even he was surprised by how hot his eyes were. "You don't get to stop anything," he said in a voice rising with every word. "You think you're better than me and that your badge makes you valuable. I served my country, and men like me fought and died so you could act like someone else." Blake pulled open the car door and pushed James inside. "Get in the car and shut up," he told him. James leaned forward, his voice still sharp, and he didn't back down even when Blake tried to close the door on him. "I may be in handcuffs, but don't think for a second that I'm the one hiding you're a scared officer. Blake is scared that he won't be anything without his outfit. You know I'm right, deep down. Shut up." Blake barked and slammed the door so hard that it rocked. He stormed to the driver's side and got in, breathing hard as he did so. His hands were shaking a little as they gripped the steering wheel. James didn't look away. He kept his eyes on Blake in the rearview mirror. "You're afraid," he said, his words cutting through the tension. "One day people will see you for what you are, a sad, pathetic little man who hides behind a badge." Blake glared back at him with an angry face, but he didn't say a word. Instead, he clenched his jaw and started the car. In the back seat, James held his head high, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and satisfaction. He knew he'd crossed a line with Blake, but he didn't care. He wasn't going to let this man silence him. As they drove toward the police station, no one spoke, but James knew in his heart that what he had said had upset someone. Blake would soon forget that James's wrists hurt from the tight cuffs as he pushed him into the cold, empty cell. The officer's face was smug as he swung the cell door shut, the metal slamming into place with a loud clang. For a moment, all James could hear was the hollow ring of the door, sealing him in. Blake stood outside the bars. With the same sneer, he crossed his arms and said, "I bet you're feeling pretty high and mighty now, huh?" His voice was full of disdain for all that tough talk because he knew he was right where he belonged. James stopped moving and took a slow, deep breath. He looked up at Blake's and asked, "Do you think this makes you strong?" His voice was low and calm, but it was filled with anger. "Do you think locking me up here makes you a big man?" "I think it reminds you who's in charge," Blake said with an even bigger sneer. "You're nothing, old man. Just another troublemaker who thought he could walk in anywhere he wanted." James raised an eyebrow and said, "I was in a diner waiting for my son. You caused a scene. But now you're acting like a hero because you got to throw around your weight." He shook his head and gave her a sour smile. "It's pathetic." Blake's face turned darker, and he slouched as he gripped the bars. "Pity you're in a cell," he spat. "I'm sorry you think I'm weak, but you should be thankful I didn't do worse." James's voice got sharper. "You're right. I have seen worse in men who thought that the only way to control someone was to hurt them or put them down. They were all losers, just like you." He hissed, "You don't know a damn thing about me." Blake's face turned red and his hands got tighter on the bars as he tried to stay calm. "You think your service makes you special, think you're entitled to something. James let out a fake laugh and said, "That's rich from a man hiding behind his badge, because that's the only way anyone will listen to him." Blake sneered as he tightened his grip on the bars. "Listen to yourself," he said. "You're just an old bitter man sitting in a cell because you can't accept that your time is up. You don't belong here. Never did." James looked at Blake's with firm defiance in his eyes. "Because you made it about what you think I am instead of who I am, I didn't belong there any less than anyone else. That's your flaw, not mine." He mumbled, "You're done," stepping back and keeping his voice low. "Rest here and think about that." He turned on his heel and left the sound of his steps echoing down the hallway. When James was alone in his cell and the noise died down, he felt the harsh concrete walls, the cold metal bench, and the bright fluorescent lights all seemed like they were meant to break a man's spirit by reminding him of how alone and powerless he was. But James wouldn't let it happen. He wouldn't give Blake that pleasure. He sat down on the hard bench with his shoulders back and his head held high. He took a deep, steadying breath and forced himself to concentrate to keep his anger from getting the best of him. But as he sat there in silence, memories of the weight of a service gun started to come back to him. He remembered the cold early mornings and the faces of men he'd fought with, some of whom had never come back. He remembered why he had served. He had fought for freedom, honor, and the right to sit in any diner in any town without facing the kind of hatred Blake had thrown at him today. His anger was building, but it was now mixed with determination. He wouldn't let Blake or anyone else make him feel small. He had fought for the right to be here and be treated with respect, and he knew that the truth would come out somehow. He had raised a son who understood justice and knew right from wrong. He knew that soon enough, his son would arrive, and Blake would have to answer for what he had done in the silence of that cell. James stood tall and determined. The fire in his heart had not gone out. James had been sitting in the cell for what felt like hours, with the cold metal bench unforgiving him. His patience stayed strong, but he felt a sense of anticipation grow within him. He knew Jordan would be here soon. His son would not stand for this. Outside the cell, down the hallway, loud voices and hurried footsteps broke the silence. James straightened up, his heart beating fast as he realized the familiar, angry voice of his son asked, "What the hell is going on here?" Jordan's voice was clear, holding the weight of authority and anger. There was a pause, a mix of uneasy muttering from the police officers around him. Blake, who had been leaning against the front desk with a smug look on his face, looked up in shock when he realized who had come. He quickly tried to hide his smugness by putting on a professional front as he walked up to Jordan Carter. "I guess I didn't expect you to be here." Blake stuttered and tried to sound calm. Jordan looked at Blake with ice-cold eyes and a set jaw. "Didn't expect me," he said again, his voice full of disdain. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think no one would say anything about how you handled my father and threw him in a cell?" Blake got red in the face and opened his mouth to say, "Sir, I didn't realize he was your father. I thought he was just a random black man you could throw your weight around with." Jordan's tone was deadly, and he took a step closer, his eyes blazing with barely controlled rage. "You didn't even bother to look at him as a person. You saw a guy you thought you could pick on and get away with it." Blake's face was pale, but he tried to get back in control. "Captain, with all due respect," he said. He was being rude and angry. "I was trying to keep the peace." The people in the diner were feeling awkward. Jordan's words cut through the room like a blade. "You, Blake, were the only one making people feel uneasy. Every witness I talked to said my dad was just sitting there quietly and doing his own thing until you showed up with your disrespect and fists. Instead of handling it properly, you put him down, spat on him, and locked him up because you wanted to feel strong. If you didn't know that Blake was your father, it wouldn't have made a difference. He was acting like he didn't belong there, and he wouldn't leave when I asked him to." Jordan's fists were clenched, and his white teeth were chattering. "You think that because you wear a badge you get to decide who belongs where you think your position gives you the right to treat people like garbage. My father has every right to sit in any diner he wants to without being bothered by someone like you," Blake said. Blake tried to keep his cool even though his voice was shaking a little. "Captain, I'm sorry if it seemed that way, but I was just following the rules. I was looking out for the neighborhood, but he wouldn't work with me." Jordan was angry because he wouldn't participate. "You spat on him, pushed him, and threw him into a cell like he was an animal, all because he wouldn't do what your ego mark said." Voice rose. Every word was filled with anger. "Blake, Do you believe that your badge gives you the power to do whatever you want and hide behind your job? Blake's pride fell apart, and his face turned red with shame and anger. With all due respect, Captain, he said. He was being difficult. He acted like he was above authority. Jordan took another step toward Blake's, putting his face just inches away. My father didn't act like he was above authority. He acted like a man with dignity, and you couldn't stand it, he said again. You couldn't stand that he wouldn't bow down to you or let you push him around. Blake looked down, and his voice was almost a whisper. I didn't mean for it to get that bad. Jordan's voice got softer, but the anger was still there. You don't get to mean anything anymore, Blake. You crossed a line, he said. You've shown everyone who trusted you to uphold the law and respect the badge that you don't deserve it. Blake opened his mouth and replied, Captain, I'm a good officer. I've been here for years. This is just one mistake. It wasn't a mistake. Jordan spoke up instead of him, fierce. A mistake is forgetting a rule or not turning in a report on time. What you did was intentional. You abused your power. You let your bias guide your actions, and you put down a man who deserved respect. You treated him like he wasn't human because of your bias. Jordan's words hung in the air, and the room was quiet. Blake and the big officers nearby stood there quietly, their faces showing a mix of discomfort and unease as they listened. They tried to avoid Blake's look. What now? Blake swallowed his words and barely made it out. Jordan's eyes became more serious. You're going to be held accountable for what you've done. You'll be subject to a formal review, and if there's any justice in this department, you'll be fired before the end of the week. We don't need officers like you who treat people like dirt. Blake's face turned red with anger and shame, but he stiffly nodded when he realized he had no other choice. Jordan took one last step back, his eyes fixed on the ground. If you think for a second that this is over, he said, think again. You will answer for every action and word. You have dishonored the badge in this department, and you don't get to walk away unscathed. Blake turned his head down. Ashen's defiance was finally broken. Jordan turned around, his eyes still red with anger, and walked to the cell where his father was sitting. The lock clicked open, and Jordan walked in. James just stood there and looked at his son with a steady look of pride and thanks. Officers watched in quiet as Jordan led his father out of the room. They could feel the tension in the air because they knew that justice had started. Jordan helped his dad leave the station, but the event still weighed heavily on both of their minds. When they got to a quiet spot outside, Jordan stopped and turned to face James. His eyes were filled with anger, sorrow, and a deep, unspoken respect for his dad. Jordan's voice started hesitantly. I'm sorry I didn't get there sooner. I'm sorry you had to sit in that cell at all. James put his hand on his son's shoulder and gently squeezed it. Jordan, you did right by me, he said in a steady, calm voice. Things are right because you didn't let him get away with it. You can't be everywhere, son, but you can make things right when they matter. Jordan's jaw tightened as he turned away, his eyes fixed somewhere in the distance. I can't believe he did that to you, he whispered, his anger returning to his face. Blake had problems, but I never thought he'd get so bad that he would spit on your dad. James's face turned angry, but he kept his cool. Men like him see power as a tool, not a duty. The badge was just an excuse for him to act angry. Wearing a uniform doesn't make you noble. Mark's fists, that's not how he should have treated you, Dad. He had no right to do that to anyone, let alone someone who has done so much for this country. The way he talked to you made my blood boil. My whole job has been to show that police officers don't have to be that way, and that we can do better. James softened his eyes and gave his son a reassuring nod. You've done exactly that, Jordan. You've shown respect, and today you showed that you won't stand for injustice, even if it comes from within your own department. That was more powerful than anything Blake could have imagined. Jordan took a deep breath, his voice heavy with emotion. This was never something I wanted you to go through with one of my cops. When I put on this badge, I swore I'd be different and make sure people like you never had to go through this again. Charles looked at his kid. His face showed that he was proud. You've done more than enough today, Jordan. You showed everyone that respect is earned, not demanded. I know you wanted to protect me, but don't carry this as your burden. And that's all a dad could ever want. The two men stood still for a moment, letting the stress of the day settle between them. Finally, Jordan nodded, and there was resolve in his eyes. Tomorrow, we'll have the official review. In a strong voice, he said, because Blake did something bad, I will make sure he has to deal with the results." James gave him a small nod of approval and told him, "Go do what needs to be done. I have faith in you, son." They looked at each other again and again and felt closer than ever. Their bond was strengthened by family, shared values, and the fight for justice. The next day, there was a lot of tension in the station's meeting room, which was full of officers, top staff, and internal affairs officials. As Blake looked around, he sat at one end of the table and moved around in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. His face was pale and drawn. Jordan sat down next to him. His face was expressionless, but the anger in his eyes was clear. The person in charge of internal affairs cleared her throat and told the room, "We are here today to review Officer Ethan Blake's actions regarding the incident at the diner involving Mr. James Carter. After this review, we will know if Officer Blake followed the rules and if he is fit to continue working for the force. With all due respect, I don't think this review is necessary. I was doing my job and following the steps." Blake looked around. His defiance from the day before had been replaced by nervous tightness as he met Jordan's eyes. He tried to sound confident, but his voice came out shaky. Jordan leaned forward, and his voice was steady but loud, arguing that spitting on an old man, beating him up, and putting him up was the right thing to do, is telling us that you followed the rules. "Sir," Blake's face turned red, but he forced himself to keep talking. "He was being rude and unwilling to leave when I asked, so I felt it was my job to kick him out for the safety of the other customers." To protect the customers, Jordan's tone got icier. "Do you think we should believe that a 70-year-old man sitting quietly in a diner was a threat to anyone? Or is it that you felt he didn't belong there?" As Blake took a deep breath and tried to calm down, he looked around the table at the other officers, but all he saw were stern looks from Stoney. "Because I thought it was the right thing to do, I did what I did." "Mister, that's the whole point, Blake. I didn't know he was your dad." The internal affairs representative leaned forward and fixed her gaze on Blake, Officer Blake. "This isn't about him being my father. It's about the fact that you abused your power. You thought you could get away with humiliating him because he didn't fit your idea of who belongs in that diner. You didn't see him as a man. You saw him as an inconvenience. You saw him as something to be controlled and disposed of." Blake's face turned red, and he looked away with his hands clenched tightly in his lap. "Captain, I didn't mean to. I just thought you could treat him like dirt because no one would call you on it," Jordan said. "You thought no one would care, and now you're here trying to make excuses for what you did. At least a few witnesses said you spit on Mr. Carter, insulted him, and hit him too hard without reason. Serious accusations have been made against you, and your actions are being closely watched. Do you have anything else to say?" There was a look of despair on Jordan's face that made Blake swallow hard. "It shouldn't ruin my career that I made a mistake because I've been a devoted cop for years. You chose to use your power to shame, insult, and punish a man who hadn't done anything wrong. And now you're sitting here hoping you can talk your way out of it." Jordan shook his head. The stubbornness of Blake finally broke his shoulders. "That's not where I meant it to go. Perhaps you didn't mean to, but that doesn't change what you did. You broke the trust that this group had in you and showed that you shouldn't have that badge." As Jordan spoke, the room went quiet. As Jordan's decision weighed heavily on their minds, the officers at the table slowly nodded in agreement. A person from Internal Affairs looked at Blake and said, "Officer," in a serious voice. "The review group thinks that Blake should be fired right away because of the proof and testimony that was given." At that moment, reality hit Blake like a punch in the face. He looked around the room but saw no support or sympathy in the eyes of his co-workers. He stood slowly, his mouth opening as if he wanted to argue but not finding the words. With one last angry look, he turned and left the room, leaving behind heavy silence. Jordan looked around the table and spoke to the officers who were still sitting down. "Let this serve as a reminder that our badge doesn't give us the right to decide who deserves respect. It gives us the duty to uphold respect for everyone in our community." Everyone in the room silently agreed. If anyone here thinks they're above that, they're free to join Blake on his way out. When Jordan rose to leave, the room fell silent as the team realized how important what he had to say. He felt a sense of satisfaction and a bittersweet reminder that justice could still be done, even if it took a while. As he left the conference room, he knew that his father would be proud of what he had done that day. Later that night, Jordan drove over to his father's house, still thinking about how the review had turned out. He had to tell the most important man about it. As he pulled P into the driveway, he saw James sitting on the front porch, with a steady, calm face lit up by the porch light. Jordan was proud of how strong his father was, but he knew that the news he brought would make him feel more than just happy. Jordan walked up to James and gave him a small nod. His son was sitting next to him, so James asked in a low voice that hinted at excitement, "What did they decide about your officer?" Jordan ran his hand over his face before answering. "They fired him, Dad, right away," he said. "All of internal affairs agreed with it, so Blake will never wear that badge again." James nodded with a sad smile on his face. Good, he thought. He didn't deserve to wear it in the first place. They sat there quietly for a moment to let the news sink in. As Jordan went over his thoughts with his dad, the cool night air filled with the sound of crickets far away. "I want you to know that everything I wrote in that review was true." When Jordan finally spoke up, he made sure they all knew how far he went wrong, and that kind of behavior had no place in our department. James looked at him, but he couldn't say what he was feeling. There was a hint of thanks in his eyes, though. "You stood up, son, and you made sure they knew it wasn't just a minor slip-up or mistake," he said. "You made sure they saw the truth." Jordan dropped his eyes and tensed his shoulders. "The way he treated you, Dad? It makes me sick to think that someone like that could have that much power and be able to act that way just because he didn't think you belonged in that diner. He thought he was untouchable." James grimaced and shook his head. He was crossing his lips. As for Jordan, he's not the first person to experience that kind of hate, and he won't be the last. It's still there in the assumptions, the disrespect, and the way people look at you like you're in the wrong place just for having a coffee. Jordan felt angry and helpless at the same time. "Dad, it's disgusting to think that anyone would see you or anyone else as less than human just because of the color of your skin," he said. "And it hurts even more to know that people like him thought they'd get away with it, and no one would care." James let out a sigh, his voice heavy with years of life experience. "This world still has a long way to go. Benjamin Shaw like Blake are okay with being mean. They say it's just part of their job or the way things are supposed to be done, and too many people don't notice." When Jordan looked at his father, his heart was heavy with anger. As James's eyes hardened and his voice stayed steady, "I don't know how you do it, Dad. You've put up with this kind of ugliness your whole life. I mean, after everything you've been through and everything you've given, they still see you as less. That's exactly why I don't back down, Jordan. If I let men like Blake make me feel small and tell me where I belong, I'd be giving them exactly what they want. And I won't do that after all the men I've served and friends I've lost. They deserve better than that, and so do I." Jordan slowly nodded, his respect for his dad increasing with each word. "Yes, Dad, they do. And you do too. I just wish it didn't have to be this way. I wish you didn't have to keep fighting just to be treated like a person." James looked down at Jordan and put a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You did your part today, son. You made sure that man faced consequences for his actions. And maybe, just maybe, it will make someone else think twice before treating the next person like they don't belong," James said. Jordan took a deep breath and let his father's words sink in. "I want to believe that, Dad. I want to believe that what happened today will make a difference. But I also know that there are other people out there ready to pull the same stunt," his father said. James gave a serious nod, which is why we're still standing. "Jordan, for everyone who has ever felt unwanted, for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong, we have to be the ones to show them that they do." The two men sat in silence for a while, letting the weight of their conversation settle between them. The unfairness, the anger, and the bittersweet victory all remained in the cool night air. Finally, James looked at his son with a small smile on his face. "You did right by me," he said. "Jordan, you made it clear to everyone today that guys like Blake will not be accepted. As long as there are people like you, things might get better." Jordan returned the feeling of happiness. "Thank you for everything you've done for me. You taught me how to respect others, stand up for what I believe in, and never give up." As they looked up at the stars, James nodded with pride. "Anytime, son," he said. Jordan knew that the fight wasn't over, but that he was a part of something bigger, and as long as his father's quiet strength guided him, he would keep fighting one day at a time for justice, respect, and dignity.